the tutor with Medic Mind for a number of years now, teaching all of the sections of the UCAT, including the topic of today's talk, which is going to be relating to the situational judgment section. In terms of how today is going to run, so we're going to be talking all about situational judgment for today's session. And to do so, we're going to be using a platform called Menti, for those of you who haven't been able to attend our last couple of sessions. It's a really great platform. It means that we can have quite an interactive session for today. And we do have quite a few questions planned for the audience, and we will also be taking in questions from the audience as well. So at the top of your screen, you can see that we've got a code for Menti. So if you're able to, please do go to menti.com and type in that code, and you'll then be able to take part in some of the activities that we've got planned for the session today. In terms of that, please do remember that we can see everything that gets posted in the Zoom chat. So please do be respectful of everyone if you are posting in the chat at all. And do be aware that we're also live streaming this as well. We hope that today is going to be really helpful in terms of giving you as much information as possible on situational judgment. So what we're going to be going over today, we're going to talk about situational judgment as a section. So we're going to discuss what is it that you're asked to do in this section. This is often the section that students kind of forget about in their preparation. So it's very important that we are aware of what can you be asked in this section and what does it entail. We're going to touch on the importance of the score that you get for situational judgment in terms of your medical school and dentistry school applications. And to do that, we'll be taking a look at last year's scores and relating them to your applications that you'll be filling out either later on this year or in subsequent years as well. We'll be talking about some of the main difficulties of situational judgment as a section. And following on from that, we've planned to go over some questions for situational judgment as well. So going over some practice questions from the section itself to highlight some of those difficulties that we'll be discussing. After that, we'll go through our top tips in terms of preparing for situational judgment, and we'll touch on some statistics as well when it comes to the number of questions you've got for this section and the timing of the section. We are going to be finishing up the section today, or this session today, sorry, with a Q&A. So that will be hopefully quite a long question and answer session where we can answer any questions that you've got. That Q&A can be focused on situational judgment, but it can also be on any of the other topics that we've touched on in any of the previous sessions that we've done. So all other sections of the UCAT, as well as potentially some non-UCAT questions as well. So if you do have any burning questions to ask, potentially about situational judgment, but also potentially not about that, please do stick around to the end and we'll be touching on those questions in the Q&A. But for now, we've spoken enough about what we're going to be doing today. Let's go on and go through an introduction to situational judgment. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to understand what is this section and what is it going to test us on. Situational judgment is the fifth and final section that you will have in the UCAT. The sections of the UCAT are always in the same order. So this is always going to be the final section that you would have. And the entire purpose of this section is to test how you would react in certain clinical settings. And there's a really important aspect in terms of why they include this as a section. The main reason for that is that when you are on placement as a medical student or as a dentistry student, or in fact, when you are a practicing doctor or practicing dentist, you are in a position of responsibility and you're in a position of power. And as a result of that, it's very important that you're able to judge situations appropriately within those roles and effectively deal with them to ensure the best outcome for yourself, for your patients, and for your colleagues. As a result of that, the situational judgment test exists as a almost litmus test to make sure that you can appropriately judge those situations and then deal with them in an effective manner. And the way in which it does that is it will present you with certain situations that will have certain dilemmas, and it will ask you how appropriate it is to react in certain ways. And it will also ask you how important certain factors are to consider when deciding how to react to a scenario. So it's all about your reactions to these scenarios that they're presenting you with. This is the last section, and it's also a section that gives you a very different score when it comes to the UCAT. So in terms of the first 4 sections of the UCAT, those 4 sections each give you a score between 300 and 900. So you'll have an overall score of between 1,200 and between 3,600. The SJT will then give you a different score. It will give you a score of between band 1, which means that you've done really well, and band 4, which means that you might not have done so well. And when it comes to the medical school applications, most applicants are really focused on that first score for the UCAT. So that score that's between 1,200 and 3,600. As a result of that, a lot of students will end up neglecting to focus on the situational judgment section, because that's the score that they believe isn't as important. And sometimes that can be very dangerous, because it means that if you neglect it enough, then you might end up not being that happy with the situational judgment section on the UCAT, which can then hinder your application. It's also important to focus on the timing aspect of situational judgment as well. A lot of the questions in situational judgment can be answered much more instinctively than questions on other sections of the UCAT. And as a result of that, a lot of students will think that there is much less of a time pressure for situational judgment as opposed to the other sections, because they think if I can answer these questions instinctively, then it means that I'm not going to have that much of a time pressure, and so I'm not going to time out on this section. That is typically the case, but it's still very important to make sure that you are focused on what this section is asking you and being able to do so in a time-oriented manner. You don't want to underestimate any part of the UCAT. And while most students will tend to find situational judgment easier to get used to than some of the other sections, it's still very easy to underestimate, and it's very important to not do so. So it's very important to make sure that you are achieving a lot of the cutoffs that these UCAT universities have. Some UCAT universities will even score the situational judgment even further, and we'll touch on a little bit of that in a couple of minutes. In total for this section, it's 69 questions in total over a period of 29 minutes. And as we said, after this section, you'll be finished with the UCAT. In terms of a good score for the SJT, the higher the better, of course, goes without saying when it comes to this. As we said, in terms of the scoring for this section, it's a score from band 1 down to band 4. So you'll either be 1, 2, 3, or 4. What we'll look at in the next slide will be a table that shows the interim scores from last year's results, also showing the percentage of people and what band they got by the end of the September sittings for the previous year of the UCAT. As you can see here, this is the spread of the bandings for the situational judgment section. Band 4 was had the smallest number of people that achieved that, which is good. So every single medical school in the UK will kind of discount your application if you do achieve a band 4 in the situational judgment. It's really important that you're scoring at least a band 3 and above. And as you can see, those are generally the most prevalent bandings, is that band 2 and band 3. So you're aiming for at least a band 3, but ideally you're looking to get into band 1. Last year, around 20% of applicants managed to achieve a band 1 in their situational judgment section, which means that they were selecting the most appropriate answers for each of those questions. In terms of what this means, a few years ago, we saw that around 16% of candidates scored a band 1 in the situational judgment, whereas the figure for last year, as we just saw, was 20%. As a result of that, being able to achieve a band 1 year upon year is now not enough to separate you from the rest of the competition. And as we know, the competition for places when it comes to medical school is so fierce. We're seeing more and more people applying for medical school every single year. And as a result of that, you really want to do whatever you can in order to make sure that your application stands out from the rest. Looking back on these percentages, therefore, achieving a band 1 in situational judgment is one of the best things that you can do to make sure that your application is standing out. And you would, by virtue of getting a band 1 at the very least last year, you would be better than 80% of the other applicants by doing so. So it's really important to take this section as seriously as possible to make sure that you're not underestimating it, and to try and do get the best banding that you can in order to set yourself apart from some of the competition. As we said, there is a slight variation in terms of how the universities will use the banding for situational judgment. We mentioned that of the universities, they will all expect a band 3 minimum in order for your application to be considered for medical school. As well as that, there are a number of universities that will go a step further, and they will include the banding that you've achieved for your situational judgment section in the decision as to whether to give you an interview or not for one of their places. So, for example, Hull York attributes 15 points for their points system to the banding that you get for situational judgment, with band 1 being the maximum 15 points. And you'll then receive 40 points for the rest of your UCAT, scores, and then a number of other points for other aspects of your application. So while it seems like you don't need to do that well, shall we say, in situational judgment in order to be able to be eligible for an interview, it can really help to set you apart from the other candidates. It can really help to boost your chances of getting an interview. And ultimately, it can be a definite positive aspect in terms of getting you into medical school or dentistry school. So it's really important to take the situational judgment seriously, to be fully aware of the types of questions you can get and how to answer them, and to put that all together to achieve the best banding possible when you sit the UCAT. We do have a blog post on where you can apply with various UCAT scores and how the situational judgment is used as part of that. So feel free to check that out if you are interested in finding out a little bit more about how the different universities use the situational judgment scoring. Great. What we're going to do from here is we're going to, first of all, take in some feedback from you, our audience, in terms of how you've been finding situational judgment currently. And then following on from that, we're going to be going over 5 practice questions of situational judgment. For those of you who haven't started preparing yet for the UCAT, which is still completely fine, those 5 questions should hopefully serve as a really useful way of showing you what some of these questions can be like and how you might want to go about starting to prepare for them. For those of you who have started doing your preparation, fantastic. These 5 questions should hopefully therefore be a really good way of checking how are you getting on with your preparation and what might you want to start integrating to be able to understand these questions better. So for students who will be sitting the UCAT, or for parents of students who will be going through the UCAT, please feel free to get involved and to answer these. The more that you can take part and interact with, the better that we can make these sessions. So please do feel free to go to Menti and put that code in. So what, for those of you who have had a look at situational judgment or have started doing some questions, what have you found difficult so far? Okay, so we've got a few references to timing there, which is really important. As we mentioned, students typically don't tend to find the timing for situational judgment the most difficult when it's compared to the other sections of the UCAT, but it's still really important to be aware of what is the timing for situational judgment, how much time do you have per question, and to therefore be having strategies that can allow you to answer all of the questions in a time-oriented manner. As well as that, you can see that there's quite a few instances in terms of figuring out what is the question, fully understanding the scenarios that they give you, and then being able to judge that question appropriately. So situational judgment on paper is probably the most simple section of the UCAT, but that doesn't mean that the scenarios themselves and having the ability to judge those scenarios is going to be simple. So it's really important in terms of that. I've seen a few answers there as well in regards to those middle options or distinguishing between the terms that they use in those answer options, which is very important when it comes to being able to answer these questions effectively. And it's something that we will touch on as we go through those 5 practice questions. So yeah, these tend to be the most common difficulties that we see from students who are sitting the UCAT and doing situational judgment. So these are completely natural, and they are difficulties that you can definitely overcome through focused and useful preparation. Okay, so thank you so much for letting me know what you found the difficulties of situational judgment to be so far. What we're going to do from here are we're going to go into 5 different questions that are based on 2 different scenarios, which are very typical scenarios that you would get for the situational judgment section. And we're going to discuss what the answers are for those 5 questions, relating it back to the difficulties that we've just discussed, and also kind of discussing how we could potentially prepare for questions like those. So we'll start off with the first question. You'll be shown an image which will contain the scenario for the question that we'll be answering. And then following on from that, you'll be asked to discuss the appropriateness of a response to that scenario. Excellent. So we'll go through the first question here. Okay, fantastic. So congratulations to the 36 of you who voted for very important in that instance. The scenario that we were looking at here was a second-year medical student who was traveling in her placement, who noticed that there was a very offensive smell that was coming from one of the areas of her placement. And in terms of this, you were being asked to decide how appropriate part of the factors were when it comes to deciding how to respond to the scenario. In this case, the answer is very important because it's very important to consider that the smell was toxic or harmful. Situational judgment has quite a few themes which tend to run throughout a lot of these scenarios and a lot of the factors that they provide you with in questions like these. And one of those main themes is patient safety. So for every scenario that you read through, one of the first things that you should think of is there potentially a threat to patient safety? And therefore, in the factors that I'm asked about for this scenario, will my reaction include something related to patient safety? Patient safety is one of the most important aspects of being a medical professional, both in terms of being a medical student as well as being a doctor, or both in terms of being a dentistry student and being a dentist. It's something that you have a responsibility for even when you're in education and when you're not fully practicing as a professional as of yet. In this instance, this is why the answer is very important, because even though the student in this case was just a medical student and a second year, they still have a responsibility to ensure that the safety of patients is upheld. And part of that involves reporting anything that might be toxic or harmful, including this smell. So that's why the answer there was very important. And this highlights the very important answer option that we've got here. So this answer option should be selected when it's one of the best ways to respond to a scenario. And in terms of that, it's when there are no negative consequences from considering this factor, but there could potentially be lots of negative consequences if you don't consider this factor, hence why it's very important to consider. So that's why this was the first answer. Okay, we'll go on to the second question here then. Brilliant. So well done to the 21 of you who voted for of minor importance in that instance. Again, this is something that you need to consider when thinking about what the consequences of considering this factor would be. So the factor in this case is that the consultant is likely to reprimand the student for being late, and that could affect her grades. There is the consequence of affecting her grades in this case, hence why it's not going to be the not important at all option, because her grades could be affected and therefore it does hold some level of importance. However, again, when considering this scenario, the main thing that we're concerned about is patient safety. This factor here doesn't take into account the potential effect on patient safety. And as a result of that, it's not going to be one of the first two options, because this factor isn't taking into account the most important aspect of the scenario that we've discussed. Hence, if it's not one of the first two options, but it's also not the last option because it could personally affect the student, that's why the answer here is of minor importance. And as we discussed previously, one of the most difficult aspects of these situational judgment questions are these middling answer options that you can be given. So students often find it very difficult to kind of discern between the ideas of important and of minor importance. And often what you'll find is that it's quite easy to get answers for very important or not important at all. But it's then more difficult to make that jump into kind of moving away from the superlatives and going towards the slightly more nuanced answer options that these middle two are. And there's several different techniques that you can use in order to circumvent this and in order to make it easy for yourself. So one of the things that I did when I was preparing for situational judgment that I always found useful was to consider, is this factor overall important or overall not that important? And so again, the way to do that is to consider what is the primary aspect of this scenario that I need to consider. We've already said here it's patient safety. This factor here does not take into account patient safety. As a result of that, you'd probably think that it's more overall not important, which means that you're trying to decide between these two bottom answers. However, like we said, if it could affect her grades, it could have a personal consequence for her. So it's not going to be not important at all, which gives you this answer of minor importance. That's one of the techniques that you can use to work through these types of questions. It's something that worked relatively well for me when I was preparing, but it's important to find a method yourself that you're comfortable with, and that you see lots of success with when it comes to preparing for these types of questions. Brilliant. So we'll go into our third question here. Great. So the majority of you have voted for not important at all. So well done for that. That is exactly the correct answer in this instance. As we said, everyone that is going into a clinical environment in some form of medical capacity has a responsibility to deal with hazards that could affect patient safety. And that's one of the main reasons why they give you the situational judgment test itself, is because they want to make sure that you are aware of the different roles that you might have to occupy in a clinical environment, and you're aware of the responsibilities and the differences in those responsibilities between those roles. So they want to know that you are aware that as a medical student or as a dentistry student, even though you don't have all of the responsibilities of a professional, so you can't prescribe, you can't perform procedures, you still have a responsibility to upholding the safety of patients. So in this instance, you would, of course, it's still your job to deal with these hazards. It's still your job to report these hazards. And as a result of that, this factor is not important at all. And again, it's not addressing the main concern that we might have as a result of this scenario. Brilliant. So we've got quite a few players there who have got all three correct so far, which is fantastic. Congratulations to you so far. We do have 2 questions left, so still plenty of time to make up for it. Right, so we'll go into the 4th question here. Brilliant. So in this case, this was a scenario relating to a colleague who thought that they might potentially be HIV positive, and was discussing the colleague's ability to continue to take part in various procedures. This is, of course, a very sensitive issue. And these are the types of issues that the situational judgment section will typically give you. So they want to know that you are able to handle these sensitive issues well, staying respectful, both to your colleagues, but also making sure that you are prioritizing patient safety in this instance. In this instance, we were given this character, Nate, who had said that they would not be brave enough to let the healthcare team know that they were HIV positive, that they did test positive. So the reaction to the response that we've been given is that they inform occupational health without Nate's permission, as she feels it is in the patient's best interest to do so. So there's quite a few important factors that we need to weigh up with this scenario. So of course, there's patient safety, which could potentially be affected, and it's very important to not be spreading anything like HIV, or to be very on top of situations like those. But there's also respect between colleagues that's really important as well, and various ethical dilemmas at play here. So you're thinking about the autonomy of Nate in this instance to be able to tell people themselves if they choose to. You're thinking about beneficence and non-maleficence when it comes to the patients that you're considering. All of these ethical pillars which come into medicine that you'll probably be looking at much more when it comes to preparing for the interviews. But they're all really vital when considering how to best handle this type of scenario. And when it comes to the appropriateness answer options, you can consider them in the same way that we discussed how to consider the importance answer options. So in terms of this, we're thinking, what are going to be the consequences if you do deal with this situation in this manner? So there are obviously going to be consequences in terms of respecting your colleague. So your relationship with Nate would potentially diminish, which is really important to consider. And you're also considering Nate's ability to continue practicing medicine as well, which is also really important. Hence why, because there are quite a few negative consequences, it's probably not one of the best ways that you could handle a situation like this. So it's going to trend towards the inappropriate areas. However, you are acting in this way because you are considering the patient's best interests. And as a result of that, you've got patient safety as one of your primary intentions with how you're acting. So because of that, it then becomes inappropriate but not awful, hence why it's that third answer option which is correct here. So congratulations to the 12 of you who said that. This is a really tricky answer option. As you can see, we've got a fairly even spread between the 4 answer options here. So it's really important to be aware of the fact that these questions are really difficult. You can ask 4 different people this question, and as you can see, you can get 4 different answers. So do be aware, if you are finding these difficult, that's completely natural, and that's entirely normal. When it comes to a lot of these scenarios that are similar to this one in the situational judgment, there is often a response which is one of the best ones that you can have, which is that you always want to deal with these types of scenarios in a local fashion. And what I mean by that is that you always want to go to the source of the dilemma first, as opposed to reporting any information to an outside source. So if you have a problem with something that Nate might be doing in this scenario, then what you want to do is to speak to Nate first before you go to speak to anyone else. So any answer option here that would have regarded, speaking to Nate and saying that he should speak to the healthcare team regarding the HIV potential diagnosis, that would be a very appropriate thing to do. And then when you're taking away his autonomy to do so, that's when you start going down the slide of appropriate to inappropriate. But dealing with these issues, what we call locally, is always the best way of handling them. So if you do see any answer options like that, the answer is very likely to be a very appropriate thing to do. Okay, we'll go into the final question here then. So in this case, the answer here would be appropriate, but not ideal. As we just said, she's speaking to Nate first before speaking to anyone else in this response, which is good. I do think that a large proportion of you have gone for very inappropriate because of the use of the verb threaten, which I absolutely agree with in terms of that. It's very important to, first of all, not to threaten anyone if you're in a position as a medical or dentistry student, and then if you're going on to practice. And that's the reason why this isn't the first option here. So the entire concept of this answer is appropriate. She's going to speak to Nate first to try and get Nate to speak up to occupational health. So as we just said, dealing with the issue as locally as possible. However, the way in which she's speaking to Nate in this instance is not okay. So threatening to inform occupational health if he doesn't. Hence why it's overall relatively appropriate, but it's not the ideal way of handling it. One of the main things to consider with these types of questions are the consequences that can happen from this. And you'll find that with these appropriate style of answers, each style of answer option, or each of these answer options, has a certain level of negative consequences that could happen. So very appropriate thing to do is often going to be one of the best ways to respond to a scenario with few to no negative consequences. Appropriate but not ideal is a way that's still an overall good way of handling the scenario, and you're considering a key aspect of that scenario. So in this instance, again, you're considering patient safety as the main aspect here. But in terms of appropriate but not ideal, there is potentially going to be a factor of that way of handling it that could be improved. So in this instance, the way that she's speaking to Nate could be improved. Inappropriate but not awful is a method of handling a scenario that shouldn't be used, but will probably have few negative consequences. And then very inappropriate thing to do is, as you might imagine, it's one of the worst ways that you would be able to handle a scenario. There'll be lots of negative consequences, and it absolutely should not be done. If you can start thinking of the answer options in terms of those different distinctions, it can become a lot easier to realize the differences between some of these very linked answer options, like appropriate but not ideal and inappropriate but not awful, and to be able to make those distinctions and get those questions right more consistently. Great. So we had one person who got all 5 questions correct. So congratulations to whoever you were. We had quite a few people as well who also got a number of other questions correct too, which is fantastic. Thank you so much for everyone that did take part there. If you got no questions correct, that's no problem at all. You've got so much time between now and the end of the UCAT period to be preparing properly. And these are types of questions that once you start getting the hang of them, once you start recognizing some of the overarching themes that come into these scenarios, you'll find that it's a very fast improvement that you can make with them. But thank you all so much for taking part in that. I hope that was useful in showing you some of the difficulties that we discussed prior to that, and I hope that was useful in terms of developing your abilities to answer those questions a little bit better and to understand them a little bit better as well. As we said, it's very important to be aware of the various aspects of timing with these questions. So you've got 69 questions. You've got 29 minutes to complete this section. So you've roughly got around 25 seconds per question when it comes to that. You saw there that we were giving you around 30 seconds per question to answer those. And I don't believe that anyone ended up kind of timing out on any of those answers, which is really good. So people tend to find the timing of situational judgment much better than the other sections, but it's still really important to be aware of. We have heard some stories of students previously who have timed out, unfortunately, and not managed to at least attempt all of the questions on situational judgment, which can have a very drastic effect on the score that you get. So it's still really important to be aware of this and to not get complacent on the timing of this section. Okay. So looking at some of the top tips that we've got for situational judgment, one of the best things that you can do is to have a look at the GMC guidance that is provided for all medical students, for all junior doctors, and naturally those apply as well to dentistry students and to dentists as well. It's called Good Medical Practice, which is essentially a handbook that allows medical students, doctors, and clinical professionals to be aware of the types of values that they need to have and ways that they might want to approach certain scenarios. It's not something that I recommend reading front to back and memorizing every single word. There's always a couple of students who go above and beyond when it comes to that, and that's not necessary. But it can be a really useful thing to look at to get a general idea of what are some of the important things to consider when you are a clinical professional. So patient safety is something that's spoken about on good medical practice, as well as that elements like respecting confidentiality of patients is something that comes into practice quite a lot in these SJT questions. And as there's also a whole host of kind of ethical issues and things to consider as well that are mentioned there. So definitely have a look at that guidance. You don't have to read it in detail, but have a look at some of the main chapters that they've got. Be aware of what they discussed, and you'll start noticing those themes and those elements cropping up in your SJT preparation. So it's a really useful way of preparation. Number two, understand the answer options. So as we were discussing there are ways that you can think about the different answer options in terms of level of consequences or whether they're overall appropriate or overall inappropriate. What you want to do is you want to have these distinctions between the answer options, because that's going to make it so much easier for yourself to pick one of those difficult answer options when you're deciding what the answer is. So as we said, the two answer options at either end of the spectrum tend to be some of the easier answers that you can get. So very appropriate or very inappropriate. So what you mainly want to focus on is understanding the differences between those middle answer options. So appropriate but not ideal, and inappropriate but not awful. You always want to put the patient at the forefront of your decision making. So anything that can affect the patients is going to be the most important things in this scenario. So patient safety, patient confidentiality, these are some of the most important aspects that you need to consider. And so that is going to tie into your answers that you give. So any answer option which considers patient safety is more likely to be one of the nicer answer options, so more important or more appropriate. And any answer option which doesn't is more likely to be on the other end of the spectrum then. That's not a set in stone rule. I've used the phrases more likely there very deliberately, so it doesn't completely rule out an answer option being appropriate if it doesn't consider a patient element, but it's just important to consider all of that there. Great. Try not to answer as yourself, but try and answer as a medical professional. So try to put yourself in the shoes of someone who is a professional and has been a professional in these types of issues. There are certain scenarios that you can be given where you yourself personally might react a lot differently to how you might need to do in that scenario. One really typical one that they like to give students is the scenario where you notice that one of your best friends is cheating on a test and you wonder whether you need to report them or not. In real life, there are quite a few people who would say that you wouldn't report them because they're your best friend. However, you need to make sure that in these types of scenarios that you're always acting with integrity, that you're always upholding elements of justice in whatever scenario that you've been given, and that you're always considering the impact on others and the consequences that could happen. So really standard answer in these SJT scenarios is that you would report a friend who has cheated after going to speaking to them and saying that they should turn themselves in for reporting or for cheating on that test. So there are some instances where you might react differently to what a medical professional would say that you should act as. And so it's really important to put yourself in the professional's shoes when you're answering these questions. Make sure that you're focusing on the response and not the scenario. So the scenario that you're given, it's very important to consider the main aspects of that. But the most important aspect of the question, and really what you're answering, is how you're responding to that scenario. So the main thing you want to consider there is how appropriate is the response, or how important is the factor in your response. So that response needs to be the main aspect. Quite a few students will often place more importance on the scenario itself. And so for that, they're kind of taking away importance from what the answer is really about. So it's always important to keep that in the back of your mind. We mentioned earlier, be aware of the role that you fulfill in these scenarios. Medical students have different responsibilities than doctors. Dentistry students have different responsibilities than dentists. Be aware of the differences in what those responsibilities are, because that will come in to your questions. A typical question that they might give you, for example, is a medical student who a patient is asking what the outcome of a test is to that student. As a medical student, you don't have the responsibility to discuss test results with patients. That should be done by a doctor. And so in that instance, you wouldn't want to be overstepping your professional boundaries. So be aware of those responsibilities, be aware of those boundaries, because they will come up in these questions. And as we said, be aware of the timing of these sections as well. If you know the timing and you know roughly how many questions you should have done around halfway through the section, it's one of the most useful ways for making sure that you don't time out in these types of questions. As an example, we've got 69 questions to do in 29 minutes. So you'd think roughly around 15 minutes into the section, you should have done roughly around 35 to 36 questions. If you haven't done 35 to 36 questions, it means that you're behind on time, which means that you need to speed up for the rest of the section. Having little strategies like that is one of the best ways that you can avoid timing out. And it's one of the best ways that you can ensure that you've got a good answer in for all of your questions. Brilliant. So what we're going to discuss now is just very quickly discuss how we at Medic Mind can help you in terms of preparing for situational judgment, as well as preparing for the rest of the application. Following on from that, we will be doing a Q&A just to round up the session today. In terms of how we can help you, one of the main ways that we offer support is through one-to-one tutoring. This is really useful because we can personalize it to yourself. So if you're having particular difficulties with particular sections, then we can go through those particular areas with you. In terms of that, it's all of the tutoring is given to you by students who have previously scored within the top 10% of the UCAT for the year that they sat the exam. So it means that you're being taught by people who know exactly what they're on about and who have gone through the exact same application process as you have. For situational judgment, we have 20 different tutorials that we go through in those tutoring sessions. As you can see, those tutorials go much deeper in depth in terms of everything that we've discussed today. So understanding your role, understanding some key principles, and going through some of those GMC topics that are so important. So areas of teamwork, making sure to act with honesty and integrity, and also respecting confidentiality as well. And using that, we can build a personalized lesson plan for you, both for situational judgment as well as for the rest of the UCAT. And we can make sure that by the time that you want to sit the UCAT, that you are really confident when it comes to that exam and all the different types of questions that you can have on that exam. As well as that, we do also support students with other elements of the application process as well. And we have got online courses for every single aspect of the application process, including a really useful online course for the UCAT. So I'll play a very quick video just to describe how we can help.
Hi there. Are you sitting the UCAT but currently unable to improve your score? Well, click below to check out Medic Mind's online UCAT course. This course has over 100 video tutorials covering 20 plus hours worth of content. Everything you need to know about the UCAT. We have over 2,000 practice questions, live weekly interactive webinars, and so much more. So grab this offer just now and click the link below in order to get instant access to this course. We can help you learn to scan, read, and verbal reasoning, and pick out those key words in order to master those questions. In decision making, we'll teach you a simple method in order to tackle even the trickiest of logic puzzles and smash those Venn diagrams. In quantitative reasoning, we'll help you master that UCAT calculator and work out how to answer questions in 2 steps or less. In abstract reasoning, we can teach you a simple method for determining a pattern in only 30 seconds. And in situational judgment, we can tell you everything that you need to know from the GMC guidelines and help you to achieve that band 1 that you need. Our award-winning UCAT course is trusted by over 12,500 students in 37 different countries. We have over 350 reviews on Trustpilot, and all the materials were written by our founder, who scored 900 on his UCAT. So don't miss out and check out this amazing offer. Let us help you get the best score possible in UCAT, and check out the link below.
Excellent. So as I mentioned, we've got lots of reviews displaying how we've helped students previously. It's always really nice hearing back from our students and hearing about how we've helped them, and also how we can improve in terms of supporting future students as well. And for those of you who, I know we've got a few questions in the chat asking about, do we help with other aspects of the application? We do. These application processes are so tricky. I remember going through the process myself and thinking that there were so many moving parts. And so we do have services that can help you with every single aspect. So we've got work experience programs, both for our medical school applicants as well as our dentistry school applicants. These can be a really useful way of achieving, getting some work experience, getting some knowledge in a practical setting, and then being able to discuss those in terms of your personal statements and your interviews. We do also help with personal statement writing as well as interview preparation. And we've also got lots of university consultants who can help you choose the best universities where they will value your application the most and where you're more likely to get interviews from. And if you want to find out any more about those resources, feel free to go to our website, medicmind.co.uk. You can find information on the one-to-one tutoring, on the online courses that we have, as well as the work experience program that we've got. I know that there were some of you as well who wanted to see the QR codes, so here they are on screen. We've got WhatsApp groups that we've set up for medical school applicants as well as dentistry school applicants as well, and so we'll be sending lots of free resources and tips into those WhatsApp groups as we go along the admissions process. So this was V1 for medicine, and then we've got one for dentistry as well. We do have free resources too. So we've got over 500 resources available online. We do have a UCAT blog where we publish lots of really helpful tips for the UCAT. And we've got our YouTube channel as well, where we post videos going over different types of questions and how to answer them effectively. We'll finish off today with a Q&A. So if anyone has any remaining questions at all, please feel free to put them here. So in terms of how to know whether to put partial agree, disagree, or fully agree, disagree, as we said, you want to consider the different kind of consequences that you could have. So if we're thinking about fully appropriate, for example, a very appropriate answer option will have no negative consequences, and it will be one of the best ways to handle that situation. Appropriate but not ideal will still have very few negative consequences, but it won't be one of the best ways to handle that situation. So it's all about considering, what are the impacts of the way that you will handle this situation, and that can decide whether it's overall appropriate or overall inappropriate. And then you need to consider the distinctions between the remaining answer options to decide which one you think is correct. We've touched on some of the main themes of situational judgment. So patient safety is a very big one, confidentiality as well. Professionalism is really vital. So, making sure that you're going about all of your interactions, both with colleagues as well as patients, in a professional manner. We've spoken about some of those in terms of the questions that we had a look at. Have a look at Good Medical Practice to see a few other really important themes. You'll also notice a lot of themes cropping up over and over as you do more situational judgment questions. There is there's not necessarily a finite amount of situations that they can give you, but you'll find that a lot of them are very similar. And so for that, you'll be answering them in very similar ways. In terms of booking a UCAT test, you can do so on the Pearson website. So the booking will not open for another week or two, I believe. And then from that, you'll be able to book. It starts on the 10th of July, I want to say, is one of the first dates. And then the end of September will be the last of the dates that you can book for the UCAT. In terms of how many questions there are per scenario, this is changing based on the previous year. So it used to be that you used to have, I want to say 55 questions for situational judgment. So they have increased that. You will get multiple questions per scenario, which will be really useful. You might have seen as we were going through the questions there that for the first question for the scenario that you answer, you do have to take a bit of time to acquaint yourself with what the scenario is asking you about, whereas for the remaining questions, you're already aware of the scenario and the difficulties of it. So you're primarily just focused on the new factor or the new response that you've got to assess. So that's the usefulness of it. I'll put the QR code up again just to finish off the session, but for now we'll go through another couple of questions if that's all right. You will be given access to the recordings, so we've been able to receive everyone's email when you've been signing up for these, so we will be providing you access with these recorded sessions so that you can watch them back. Okay, situational judgment is really interesting when it comes to the marking of it, and this is why the answers are separated into bands. So, for example, if the answer is very appropriate and you've selected the answer of appropriate but not ideal, that's what we would refer to as a band 2 answer. So you haven't got the question correct, but you are not that far off from what the answer actually is. And that's the reason why we've got bandings for these questions, as opposed to the other sections where you've just got these discrete quantitative values. So that's probably the reason why it's come up with a yellow mark on it instead of red, because you're close to the answer. You haven't selected the exact right answer option, but you're still relatively close. So it's kind of like getting half a mark for the question, really. What it means is that you're in the right area in terms of what the answer is, but there was probably potentially a detail that you might have missed out on that meant that you didn't get the exact correct answer. So in that case, like we said, if the correct answer is very appropriate and you select appropriate but not ideal, that would be what we call a band 2 answer, because you're one off of what the correct answer is. In terms of what band I got, I found that throughout my preparation, I was getting a mixture of band 1 and 2s. I ended up getting a band 2 on the day of the exam, which I was a little bit disappointed with. But band 2 is still something that you can easily get into medical school with. You just have to be strategic with where you apply so that you maximize the strengths of your application with where you're going. And if you're interested in that, feel free to check out some of our blogs. And we've also got university consultants who can help you to strategically apply to the places that will fully satisfy the strengths of your applications. Ways to see the patterns in abstract reasoning. In terms of abstract reasoning, you want to have a set kind of algorithm that you can go through to see patterns that you're confused on. We at Medic Mind, we have an algorithm called Sponks that we're massive fans of, that we teach our students. So feel free to check out some of our resources, check out our YouTube videos, speak to some of our tutors as well if you'd like to find out a bit more about that. I really didn't like abstract reasoning when I was preparing. It was a section I enjoyed the least. So I think it's really important for that. If there's a section that is confusing you more than most, make sure that you're working on them harder than the rest to try and make up for that. The UCAT is an exam that can punish your weaknesses if you don't work on them effectively. I'll finish off by showing these QR codes again. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. And if you do have any further questions or you want to get in touch with us at all, feel free to give us a call on our 020 number, or feel free to send us an email as well, and we can reach out to you from there. But thank you so much for attending.